This week, a coalition of 19 different attorneys general sent a letter to the U.S. Senate leaders strongly opposing President Biden's nomination, Nancy Abudu, to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Now, Abudu is currently employed as the Strategic Litigation Director for the Southern Poverty Law Center. You probably are familiar with this organization. It's a corrupt organization known for targeting its political opponents with its hate group label. Yeah, that probably rings a bell to you. But if that were not enough, earlier this month, an attorney who literally worked in the office with Abudu at the SPLC was arrested and charged with domestic terrorism. And of course, the SPLC inspired the now convicted terrorist Floyd Corkin, who came to the FRC Washington office about a decade ago with the intent of a mass murder. Well, we have 19 attorneys generals who have signed a letter onto this, and it's a clear indication of the threat that Abudu would have on the bench. So joining me now to discuss this is the Attorney General leading that entire effort, Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall. Attorney General Marshall, thank you so much. Welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you, Jody.
Well, listen, it's a pleasure to have you. Before we discuss Nancy Abudu, explain to the viewers, if you would, and our listeners, why this 11th Circuit Court of Appeals is so important.
Well, this is our federal appeals court for both Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, which hears many of the significant cases and challenges that we have occurring in our state. And it's why it's so important that we have a jurist and not an activist to be able to serve on that court. And you've already highlighted many of the issues relating directly to the SPLC. But can you imagine if we now allow the head of strategic litigation for that agency, one who's a part of a group that's called law enforcement, the true collective threat to our society, to suddenly sit and decide cases?
Yeah, I mean, you start looking through, and I know you, and I look forward to getting more of your comments here, but just the research I've done, this woman is pretty frightening. And to think that she could be on this court is just really frightful. So let's talk about the letter. You thankfully, and I say that in all sincerity, thank you for your leadership with this, leading the letter to Senate leaders. And what are you saying in the letter? Who all have joined you? And what do you anticipate is going to be the result here?
Well, we have a substantial majority of Republican attorneys general have joined us, which is unique because, again, there's only 3 states that are subject to the 11th Circuit, but they recognize that if we allow this nominee to be able to get through the process, what could be coming to their circuits? I mean, this is a nominee that said Florida is trying to keep poor people from voting. She said that Alabama is attempting to reinstate today white supremacy. She said that Georgia's law enforcement has a culture of arresting those people of color. I mean, can you imagine if Alabama has a voting rights case in front of her, whether or not we'd receive a fair shake? Or if you're a law enforcement officer, when the question of your qualified immunity is being challenged, whether or not you believe you're going to receive a fair shake. And, you've already spoken to one of the lawyers under the SPLC being charged with domestic terrorism. And the response of that organization was not to condemn the actions of their attorney, but instead to say that law enforcement was overzealous. I mean, this is clearly not a nominee that needs to be serving on our federal bench. And I'm very pleased to not only see the significant support of our colleagues, but already the response that we've heard from many in Congress.
Well, and you've hit on this too. I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into this if we can, but it's not just the fact that she works for a disreputable organization, but her judicial philosophy is severely flawed from what I've seen. Can you go a little bit deeper and give us some examples of what she really believes on some important issues?
Well, particularly around the voting rights issue, we've seen that she argues through misrepresentation about the status of voting in the respective states covered by the 11th Circuit. For example, she was able to help author a report about Alabama's voting practices that were filled with misrepresentations. And in fact, we had to have the ability to be able to respond to that. When we look at our state, when we have record numbers of voter registration and voter participation, when we've seen no reduction in voter participation as a result of voter ID, for example, in Alabama, a practice and a law that's been validated by this same 11th Circuit that she seeks to join. What we've learned is that she's not a zealous advocate for the positions of her client, but she's one that will personally misrepresent the facts for anybody that's opposed to her position. We've seen that's the practice of the SPLC. I mean, clearly they target groups that are contrary to the SPLC's worldview, but also we've seen in her capacity as a lawyer that she's echoed that not only through the filings in the respective courts in which she's appeared, but in her personal comments as well as those other organizations in which she associates herself with.
Well, that's really pretty stunning. I saw that she also supports this unconstitutional idea of pre-clearance, which we pushed back in my time in Congress, pushed back on that, but it would basically require certain states to get approval from the Department of Justice before they can enact any kind of election integrity laws. All of this is disturbing. What do you anticipate is going to happen? I mean, she supports all these wrong things, but what's your take on where's this headed?
Well, one of the things that we hope is there's new information contained in our letter. And one of the things that we would like to see is that it be sent back to the committee for further questioning to allow for our senators to inquire specifically about the example recently of the arrest of the lawyer for domestic terrorism and where she stands on that. Does she object to what her lawyer did? Does she believe it was unlawful? Was that an appropriate action for an attorney? And then also to be able to highlight again many of the positions that she's taken. You know, clearly the Senate could deny the ability of this nominee to move forward, which would be the best case scenario. But at a minimum, we would love for there to be more investigation into not only her personal philosophy, but how that personal philosophy ultimately will impact her role as a potential judge.
Yeah, that's great. And I certainly think this could add fuel to the fire of the investigation of her. Currently, there's no scheduled vote that I'm aware of. I haven't seen where they've scheduled a vote for her. But it would seem to me that you know, if one of her employees is arrested on domestic terrorism charges, I mean, and her organization defends that individual. I mean, the SPLC, as you referred to, didn't condone. They doubled down in defending him. That should be enough to sink this whole campaign by itself, it would seem to me.
Yeah, and let's also remember what they were protesting, and that was the building of a law enforcement training facility. To the extent that we worry or are concerned about whether or not she can fairly evaluate the actions of law enforcement. And that's both on the criminal side, right, is to work that we're doing to hold individuals accountable, but also when evaluating civilly the work of law enforcement, how in the world can we believe that she can treat those individuals fairly?
Absolutely. Well, Attorney General Marshall, I want to thank you for your leadership in this and deeply grateful for that. We appreciate you joining us this evening on Washington Watch.
Thank you.